Welcome to another episode of Inside Medical Malpractice. This is a continuation in the podcast series on some of the most problematic malpractice issues in healthcare, and it's our third episode on medication errors. I'm so glad you're here today because this is part 2 with my amazing guest, RaDonda Vaught. On March 25th, 2022, a jury found RaDonda guilty of criminally negligent homicide for her part in a case that involved a fatal medication error. A criminal prosecution for an unintentional medication error is rare, but it happened. And if you haven't heard part 1 of this podcast, please go back and listen. It focuses on the details and the events of the fateful day RaDonda accidentally gave a paralytic drug to Mrs. Charlene Murphy. That episode ends with the amazing story of a chance meeting of Mrs. Murphy's grandsons while RaDonda was buying chickens at a Tractor Supply store. This morning I was looking through some quotes from my daughter Kate to use on her beekeeping website, and I came across one by author Jodi Picoult that made me think of RaDonda's experience of meeting Mrs. Murphy's grandson. Let me share it with you. Heroes don't leap tall buildings or stop bullets with an outstretched hand. They didn't wear boots and capes. They bled and they bruised, and their superpowers were as simple as listening or loving. Heroes were ordinary people who knew that even if their own lives were impossibly knotted, they could untangle someone else's. And maybe that one act could lead to rescuing you right back. If you haven't heard episode 1, I'm telling you, go back and listen. I don't even have the words to describe how powerful it is. 2 things I want to mention about that first podcast. Firstly, it didn't come up in the episode that at the time of this medication error in 2017, RaDonda was a relatively new nurse. She'd only graduated from nursing school in 2014 and started working at Vanderbilt Medical Center in 2015, just 2 years before the incident happened. She was a bright, shiny new nurse with relatively little experience. The second thing I can't stop thinking about is how I loved the way RaDonda pointed out at the beginning of that podcast that this isn't just about her. Her exact words were, "This story is so much bigger than me, and I only have this story because someone lost their life." Today, we're going to share more of RaDonda's story and the story of many of the other people who were involved in her life during the past 5 years. As I said at the end of the part 1 of this podcast, I didn't mean for it to be 2 episodes, but there was so much to talk about. And hopefully, there's more to come in a follow-up podcast in the future. So without any further comment, let's get underway. Because it seemed like things had kind of calmed down. And I don't know if gone away, but maybe you felt right, that's dealt with. And then it seems like nearly a year later, there was, from what I've read, and please set us all straight on this, that there was a anonymous tip, a surprise inspection, a criminal indictment, federal investigation. How did it go from where you were on that day in Tractor Supply to trial? What happened there?
So actually, the investigation happened. Those had all happened prior to meeting her grandson. Those happened over the course of from August, when I met with the Board of Nursing originally, until October, when I received a letter from them saying they'd concluded their investigation and weren't going to take any action against my nursing license, and also that no record of it was going to appear on my nursing license, which I thought was maybe overly gracious. I don't know. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting some sort of corrective action, reprimandation, something. But I was relieved to at least have some form of communication on what was happening. And within a couple of just a week, maybe, another investigator called. They were asking questions very specific to Vanderbilt. And then not long after that, the news came out with their story. The CMS report was released. And within another couple of weeks, I was back at the Department of Health interviewing with another investigator. And then at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, talking to Ramona Smith. And so that was all very loaded into a short amount of time there over the span of a few weeks.
Was that a surprise that all that happened, or were you expecting those interviews to happen?
I wasn't expecting, any of it to be publicly on the news. That was a surprise when it happened to me. I got a phone call from a friend. I was on the way to work, maybe 5 minutes from Centennial one evening, and she knows I don't watch the news or really, follow social media. I live very much in my own world here on the farm. I have enough to take care of. I don't need to squirrel dive down into a rabbit hole of what's happening in the outside world. So she called to let me know that, this story was on the news. It wasn't my name, but it was very clearly my event. And there were things happening. So I was aware, but, other people were not aware that it was me. And, I did these interviews, I did these investigations all without an attorney. And then things got very quiet. The PR machine at Vanderbilt works well. The things went out of the news. Nothing was heard for 2.5 months. And then I got a phone call at the very end of January of 2019 from Agent Smith letting me know that she had a warrant for my arrest and that, she was giving me the opportunity to come down to the TBI and turn myself in to make it a little bit easier, so they wouldn't have to show up Monday morning with a warrant at my job or my home.
Okay. So tell me what that was like. What's going through your head and your heart when all this is going
on? It's spinning. It's spinning. I asked her, she started the conversation by saying, well, I'm sure you know why I'm calling. And I said, no, I don't. She said, I have a warrant for your arrest. And I asked her, for what?
What are the charges? Yeah, for what?
So this was on a Sunday. She'd obtained these from the grand jury, but they weren't set to be released until Monday. So this was her way of giving me a heads up. She wouldn't tell me what the charges were until Monday, but she did tell me that my bail was $50,000, and I had to pay a bail bondsman $5,000. So I had to obtain a bail bondsman without knowing what the charges were, and take them a large check and convince them, to come get me out of jail once they and I did know what the charges were, which was kind of an odd situation. But, nonetheless, I made it happen. I went to the TBI. My father-in-law took me. The booking process went as a booking process goes, I guess. That was an experience.
Which is what I think most of us don't know, luckily, what a booking process is. What happened there?
So I turned myself in at the TBI headquarters. And from there, Agent Smith, read me my rights, and, she made me face the wall, and she used these tiny pink handcuffs, which she's like, I'm going to use the little pink handcuffs. I don't know if that was supposed to make me feel better or what. She handcuffed me behind my back and then put me in the back of her car and drove me downtown to Nashville. And, walked me into this little outside booking area. If my hands would have at least been in front of my face, I could have wiped the snot off of my nose.
So you're crying.
Yeah. She's got lights on, flying through traffic like I'm some kind of dangerous criminal with my hands cuffed behind my back. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I'm not a threat to you. I was not a threat to her. Look at me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not a threatening person. I was so cooperative with everything. And it just, in hindsight, I found it exceptionally unprofessional of her to let me know that she was going to use these tiny pink handcuffs that she couldn't figure out how to use and then handcuff me behind my back so that I couldn't wipe the snot off my face as she flew down, the highway to book me into Davidson County Jail. Whatever. That's neither here nor there, but that's the experience. And then I got to watch a young woman have a partial psychotic breakdown in the jail. That was really fun. And an inmate brought me a sandwich and a bag of chips and an apple and said, "You don't look like you belong here." And then the people who were working, the jailers, took multiple sets of fingerprints and DNA swabs due to the nature of my crime. And then I called my father-in-law and said, "Get me the hell out of here. Where is the bail bondsman?"
So the nature of your crime being a medication error 4 years earlier, that's why they took swabs and DNA?
The nature of my crime being homicide and abuse.
Oh my God.
A class C felony and a class D felony. So 2 felony charges.
And do you know this yet? Do you know these charges as of this time?
Yeah, she told me the charges when I showed up to the TBI headquarters. She told me what the charges were. So I was aware of what they were. Yeah.
Did you know what they meant?
No, not really. It sounded awful. It sounded really bad. And, I had no experience with the law. I do not watch criminal court television. I do not watch CSI or Law and Order. That is not my jam. I need something brainless and funny in the background, like The Office or anything just funny that doesn't require my brain to work. There's enough going on in there. Complex, scary things like that doesn't entice me. I just was so naive, Chris. I was incredibly naive. And people ask me now, what should you do if something like this happens? My first advice is, unfortunately, get a lawyer or consult someone who knows about the law, because I knew nothing. And granted, I don't know if I would have changed the fact that I talked to everyone and was transparent, because I don't think that that's the problem here. But I certainly didn't do myself any favors by not understanding what my own rights were, because I did have rights.
How could that have gone differently, do you think, if you'd had a lawyer during that time?
So during the course of talking with the TBI, they read me my Miranda rights when I went in to talk with her early in December. This interview was recorded. It was 2 hours, and they played that back during the course of my trial. And again, like I said, I didn't understand so naively. I didn't understand at the time that she was asking questions to gather information against me, not Vanderbilt. Me. I only know that now because I can look back at the timeline of things and see how they evolved, and the date that she finally started to interview people and the date that she interviewed me and the things she asked me about. So the very end of this conversation, after she'd read me my Miranda rights and after I'd talked to her for 2 hours and told her everything I would have done, should have done, could have done differently, she was kind enough to let me know that she would make sure that the DA knew how cooperative I'd been. And I was like,
Thanks a lot. Yeah. I think many people are still confused and or surprised at how you went from how your case went from your nursing licensing body decision, your nursing association decision, some time passes, you have these interviews, and then who and what made the decision to go criminal with this, or to raise criminal charges against you? How do you end up in jail when you've just basically been absolved from any wrongdoing by your nursing association?
So the Board of Nursing, actually, they fall under the Department of Health for the state of Tennessee. And the Department of Health has their Office of Investigations, and then different investigators within that body that will investigate facilities, nurses, doctors, massage therapists, dentists, whatever the licensure or regulatory group is. The Board of Nursing investigator, they concluded the investigation against me, wrote that letter, but actually during the time frame that they were still coming up with their decision, they felt like there was enough information that it was warranted to go to the facility to see how much responsibility lied with them. So, and both of these are happening at the same time behind the scenes. There is a whistleblower report to the Department of Health, and that talks about some things that the facility investigators discovered, which was that there was no, the patient's death was not reported properly to the Social Security Administration. The patient's death was stated as natural causes. There was no mention of the medication error to the medical examiner or on her death certificate or in her chart. There was no corrective action plan written or any corrective action taken. This would have been 11 months after. No corrective action had been taken, and it hadn't been reported to CMS, which was, federal guidelines. So at that point, CMS got involved. So CMS is a federal program, and it's implemented at a state level, regulated at a state level, and investigated when it's not used properly at a state level.
What do the letters CMS stand for?
Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, I believe. I'm sorry, I forget you're in Canada, so you're not thinking about some of the things that okay, sorry about that. The Centers for Medicare.
No, that's okay. Most of our listeners are in the U.S.
The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So it's reimbursement for Medicare and Medicaid patients. Either most of the time, Medicare and Medicaid applies to people who are retired or beyond the age of retirement, or those who are, disabled, wards of the state, or very young, like children who don't have health care. So they're federal programs to provide health care, essentially payment and reimbursement for those facilities who have met the guidelines or agreed to meet the guidelines for reimbursement for care of those patients.
So the funding is conditional that the guidelines are met, that the standards are held up. Yeah, got it.
You got it. Correct. Yes, this is a federal government agency or program. Sorry, my terminology is a little off there, but a federal government program, and it's implemented at a state level. And then, so if something is wrong, it is investigated by the state's Bureau of Investigation. So for us, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And when you talk about areas of the law, the Board of Nursing, which is who I would initially was reported to, that is administrative law. If the family were to have taken action against me, that's civil law. If a body of a criminal investigative body like the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation or a police officer, that's criminal. So you have criminal, administrative, and civil law. This is how it reached criminal law. It reached criminal law because CMS was brought in, because Vanderbilt failed to meet all of these requirements, which was discovered because the Department of Health decided to investigate the facility. And when they found what they did, CMS was involved. When CMS got involved, that triggered the TBI investigation. Now we are in the criminal realm of the law. And to be quite honest with you, I was a super easy dangling little fish to catch. I made myself an easy target.
In what way? Why do you say that, RaDonda?
Well, because, I gave them everything they needed to, to come up with a way for my admission of what happened to fit some description of criminal law of the code, so that they could decide, okay, we're going to charge you with, these two things. What I would not expect is that a criminal investigation would happen and someone wouldn't be charged, right? A patient died here. Vanderbilt is involved. Literally the shining gold star of healthcare in the state of Tennessee. They're hugely influential. They are the single largest private employer in the state. No one doesn't know someone who works there, or multiple people who works there, or has been a patient there. I mean, everyone knows who Vanderbilt is.
And I would bet nobody wants to take them down.
Nope.
No. But it's interesting when you said that they found some infractions. Sorry, what was I'm sorry about the short term you used, as
CMS. Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Right. So the infractions that they found, that in my mind, I immediately circled back all the way to the very, very beginning of this story, when everyone in the hospital said to you, these are systems errors. There's systems problems here. Were those two things connected?
Sure.
Like the infractions that they discovered, and then I'm assuming eventually had to be fixed, were they the same infractions that contributed to the error that you made?
Yeah, there were certainly some things that they pointed out and that they found that needed to be improved. There were also a lot of things that I found along the way that were really close contributing factors that really I'm the only one, me and whoever else I've talked to about it, things that, still never really have made a big impact in the level of understanding. But there were some things. There were guidelines that were put in place now for transporting patients. There are changes in the way that paralytic agents can be retrieved and overridden. There are changes in their monitoring guidelines overall, not just with transporting patients, but with the guidelines for monitoring. I believe some changes with their sedation or conscious sedation policy. I don't think they had, they didn't have some policies. Versed was not listed as a high alert medication. I'm still not sure that it is listed as a high alert medication in their drug categorization. No barcode scanning in the radiology department, which I believe it was actually still several months later, even after they wrote their 100 and something page, plan of corrective action to meet the compliance standards, which they really jumped through hoops in a short amount of time to do. There were still things that were on their list planned to do, but they hadn't been implemented yet. And so it took several more months, I think, for all of those things to finally take place. But even that, even still, those weren't all of the things that really could have contributed. Nothing in regards to the communication errors, nothing in regards to how, the use of overriding was a part of our standard practice. Nothing in regards to why wasn't the drug ever there?
That's a huge question in my mind. Why was that drug outside of an operating room or some kind of procedural room that was staffed by an anesthetist? Why was that drug ever there?
Well, I'll tell you. So our unit, we have critical care doctors that are staffed 24/7 to take care of just the 24 critical care patients on our unit. We intubate a lot of our patients. Sometimes we have to keep them intubated and sedated for an extended amount of time, whether they have, whether they're having blood pressure issues from an aneurysm, whether they're post-operative from some massive tumor resection in their brain. And we really need to, keep their intracranial pressure down, their blood pressure down, et cetera, whether they're having epileptic seizures, so we used various different drugs for intubation, sedation, and paralyzing. And apparently, vecuronium was, and it's obviously an older drug. There are drugs that are more rapidly acting and that can be more rapidly reversed, like rocuronium or succinylcholine, which were probably the ones that we definitely used more often. But vecuronium, I think, was there just because it's still one that if you're going to do maybe long-term paralyzing, was on some profile for the neurologist to use maybe. But, all of our paralytic agents were there in our Pyxis. And I do recall, they're there, they're there because we do have to use them. And we do procedures with our critical care anesthesiologist in the rooms a lot. We would do trachs, pegs, all kinds of different things at the bedside. We would put in, we would literally drill holes into people's brain and insert drains into them, to relieve their intracranial pressure, all these things that we would do at the bedside. And so we were not necessarily unfamiliar, or it wasn't outside of the scope of practice that would have been done on our unit to have access to those drugs. It just wasn't necessarily something that we all did every day, but it was justifiable for them to be there. But it's certainly worth considering, where they are and how they were located in there. They could have looked different. Something.
Sure. Yeah, I forgot you worked at a neuro ICU. Of course, you'd have access to those drugs. But that's always been a question I have. Why did everybody have access to that drugs? Why was that part of the general patient? But anyway, I'm glad. And so has that changed? Have they moved those medications now or given different access points?
They're still there from what I understand. I believe that vecuronium is no longer on their override list, but rocuronium and succinylcholine are. And now you have to type in para, P-A-R-A, and then the drug name in order to retrieve a paralytic agent. And I believe there's also the second person tuner.
Okay, so we got to the point where you're in jail, and it's so far sounds like a pretty terrible experience. What happens next?
After that, the Board of Nursing, they actually got a call from their general counsel from the Department of Health that afternoon when I, posted my bail and made it home. And I just told her, I am not interested in talking to you or anyone until I need to find myself an attorney. I'm in way over my head here. Several months went by. We had a discussion hearing, several discussion hearings within the criminal court. My initial hearing where I pled not guilty, and then we proceeded down, the options of discussing whether or not we would settle the case criminally. And in the meantime, the Board of Nursing was in the background kind of pushing for me to surrender my license or, retire them or give them up in some form or fashion, but without really any formal charges or request to do so. There there were some things that went back and forth, but they even threatened something called a summary suspension, just like summarily suspend someone's license. Are you familiar with that?
Not too much, no.
Okay, so it's what the Department of Health or a board, a regulatory board, could utilize that process. Say an emergency room doctor comes in and they're high on cocaine because they're working 24 hours, or a surgeon is drunk, or a nurse is diverting fentanyl and going to the bathroom and injecting it intravenously. Someone who is an imminent threat to themselves and the public, like an imminent danger. That would allow a board to step in and summarily suspend that person's license and ability to practice so that they could immediately be removed as a threat to public safety. So they threatened that, which obviously wasn't warranted. At this point, I wasn't even working at the bedside. As soon as I got the call that I would have to turn myself in, the very next day, I spoke with my manager. I told her, you're going to have to remove me from my schedule. I explained to her what was happening, and I just told her, I'm happy to continue working if there's some capacity. If I can sit in an office, a desk somewhere, I'll file paperwork, I'll do something, but I can't work with patients. I can't work with their families, and I can't be visible to the public. I don't necessarily want to quit, but you can't put me out in front of people right now. It's not going to work very well, for you or for myself. And so I was working in bed management. I was working in an office, in the back of the hospital, in a completely non-clinical area. I didn't wear scrubs to work. I didn't interact with people at all. And only for a few months was I even in the hospital. By November of that year, we actually transferred to a call center. And then, of course, COVID hit. And by March of the following year, I was working from home for the last year and a half of doing that job. So I wasn't a threat to the public. I had no access to patients, no part of their care. And during the course of that, there was a lot of back and forth, and the Board of Nursing actually did file formal charges against me. But of course, COVID delayed all of that. It delayed the hearing with the Board of Nursing, and it delayed any further progress in the criminal courts. Everything went into a moratorium, and it essentially stopped until it picked back up in July of 2021 when we went back before the Board of Nursing. And they starkly changed their mind and revoked my license.
Oh, boy. What was that? Okay, so what was that year like for you? We've got that over your head when COVID hit and everything's just delayed.
Oh, God, it was years. It was years. I mean, so think about it. This was the end of 2017, basically 2018 when this started. So you got the entire year of 2018, the entire year of 2019, 2020. We're halfway through 2021 now. I mean, this was just hanging over my, just my life, and every day, and not even just every day, so many times throughout the day, it didn't matter what I was doing, what I was not doing, how I was feeling. It hits you like a ton of bricks over and over and over and over again. You just never know what's going to trigger all of that to come back. And then you think about your life moving forward. You're like, I've spent, 4 years on this degree and, another year and a half working on a doctorate degree that I decided to stop doing because I loved that job at Vanderbilt so much that I wanted to stay at the bedside. All of this time, all of this love, I had this job that I told people how much I loved it. I loved it. I will never quit that job. I'm not one of those people that just goes to work at Vanderbilt because I want it on my resume because it says Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and then I want to leave and apply for CRNA school or whatever, and that's fine. Listen, don't take that as offense to people who want to do that. You want the experience. That's cool. I wasn't one of those people. I wanted to be there because I loved it, because I loved the patient population. I loved where I worked. And it was, it was a heartbreaking loss on top of all of the guilt that I felt, about someone losing their life, and what was my life going to be like moving forward? Am I going to lose my license or not? If I do lose my license, then what happens? What are my skill sets going to be? When is this court thing ever going to happen? Am I going to be found guilty? Am I going to go to prison after that? What's that going to be like? I mean, it was just constant. You literally can't plan for anything. You can't plan for anything because you just don't know. And I have a newfound level of empathy for people who find themselves involved in the criminal justice system. Yeah, it's it sucks the life out of you in a way that is really hard to process. You're just in it. You're just in it, and it sinks its teeth in you, and you're just there, sitting and waiting.
How did you get through it? What did you do?
I don't know, one day at a time. A day at a time. I have a lot of wonderful people in my life. My husband, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my sister-in-law, like they all live within, an hour and a half or so. A lot of great friends, neighbors, literally that I would consider my family unit right here close to me. Strangers, who random acts of kindness, just a day at a time. I wouldn't say that there was any one thing in particular, just one day at a time. A lot of surviving, not thriving.
Yeah, I can imagine. What was the reaction from the nursing world during this whole mess that was going on?
There's a variety of different reactions based on the time frame. Initially when there was still very little known in the news and it was really fresh, most people's opinion were, why didn't she notice? Why couldn't she just scan it? Why not this? Why not that? And they're asking questions to things, and they're relevant questions. Things that, I literally listened to those conversations happen in the break room and all throughout the unit for 3 nights in a row when this story was coming out. I walked in the hospital and it was the first thing I heard. And it was all I heard all night. Just a lot of questions, why not this? Why not that? And then once my charges were made public about 3 months later, there was kind of a mix of people who understood at least enough about reading a CMS report to gather some facts. There was some outrage. And then there were some people that were like, well, she deserves that. And then as time went by, there wasn't a whole lot during COVID that was said. But as my Board of Nursing hearing approached, there were some different organizations and groups like ISMP had a lot to say. And they wrote some really fantastic articles with, I really respected and appreciated their point of view. And it felt somewhat validated to understand, like, it's not just me and some other people that feel like this isn't right. And then really when my trial approached, there was more support. I couldn't have imagined, though, when my sentencing hearing happened, the amount of support that picked up in that, period between March to May. It was overwhelmingly just unfathomable, the amount of people. There are a lot of good people in the world, Chris. There are a lot of very good and very kind people in this world. And, without this experience, I wouldn't have ever been able to receive that. So that's one thing I am really grateful for. And I try to remind myself, just moving through life, it's one of the things that has kind of gotten me through is remembering how kind people have been to me, and they don't have to do that. Yeah, this is one box of letters, but there are folders and folders and boxes of cards and letters that people have sent, just saying something nice, something kind, that it adds up, and that helps. Those things really, they give you more drive and purpose, to just push through it. And it reminded me that I always felt like I needed to do this, not just for myself, but for the nursing profession. I told my husband, I'm like, this just isn't right, and he says, you need to try to settle this. You could settle this and you don't have to go to court. You don't have to risk being found guilty and being sent to prison. And I said, what do I have to lose? And he said, you could literally go to prison. And I'm like, so I'll go to prison. It's not right. It's not right. It's not right. And like,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes you just have to stand up and say, no, it's not right. This isn't right. And two wrongs don't make a right. I'm not saying that I wasn't wrong in my actions, but this course of action isn't right. And it's not okay if I sit back and agree to this and say, I'm going to concede that I'm guilty of these two things and settle this out of court. All of this information is washed down the drain. No one knows. It gets swept under the rug. And then I have set the standard that this is what nurses are supposed to do. The world is watching. I'm not willing to do that. And he said, I remember him saying to me, you can't save healthcare. This is about you. You have to remember you're the one on trial here. It's very true. I was the one on trial here, but I felt like it wasn't just me. It was all of these people and all of the other people who had reached out to me and said that one little phrase, this could be me. That could have been me.
I've never told you this, RaDonda, but I wrote you a letter too a long time ago, 3 years ago. I happened to be in Florida, spending one COVID winter in Florida, and actually it was your trial. It was during your trial. And that was so, of course, it was all over the news all day, every single day. And so I got right caught up in it. But you're right, the whole world was watching. I just happened to be in Florida when it was happening, but I would have been watching it here. But I just want to say thank you for fighting that big fight. I mean, I can't even imagine how difficult it was, and maybe still is, for some of the fallout. And I know you're not nursing anymore and may never nurse again. But thank you for fighting the fight. I mean, I don't know if it turned out like you hoped it would.
But it's getting there.
Yeah, good. And I just want to say thanks to your man, to whoever it is. He sounds like you've got a good guy there. And thanks to him for standing by you through all this.
He's a solid guy. I don't have a good picture. Yeah, he is the most unique person that I have ever met in my life. And I don't know how, I managed to have such an amazing person.
And a shout out to his family too, because you've mentioned the in-laws a couple times when it came to tough moments, and people helped the people.
Oh, yeah. I love them. Yeah, they've been fantastic. I mean, not everyone has such a great relationship with their in-laws. I love my mother-in-law. I love her.
I bet she loves you too, girl.
She does. She does.
So let's get to the trial. Can you tell us about that? Because certainly that's the most public part of this whole mess that the whole world did see some of anyway. Talk to us about the trial.
I really didn't. I kind of had an idea of what to expect, but I looked through all of the information, thousands of pages of evidence over the last several years leading up to it. I did a lot of that work in the background for my attorney, really trying to make things so easy and transparent for him to see, like, all of these things that I felt were pertinent and relevant. There were some moments in the trial where I felt like things went well. And then, like, we were making really clear points, valid points. But there were other moments of the trial where it just felt extremely rude and a little degrading, to be honest with you. Some of the remarks from the DA and some of the looks, from the three individuals sitting there at their bench. It was very clear to me that it felt like a game.
I think I've been an expert witness on the stand several times, and just recently read a judgment of a trial that I've been involved in where the attorney that I was working for was successful in the trial, but there were several comments from the opposing counsel that were made about me. And so I don't have on the same personal level as you do, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's the only way I've gotten through a lot of those trials, is to see it as a game. They're doing their job. They're doing what they think is the best they can do to represent their client. Pardon me. And to remind myself that it's really got not much to do with me. It's all about winning the case. But did you testify during your trial? Like, were you ever on the stand?
I didn't.
And why was that decision made?
Well, I actually had every intention of, testifying. I felt like, as you can say, hearing me now, I had a lot to say, and, and nothing to hide. I had nothing to hide. And, it was literally in my attorney's office the night before, we would have started our defense, and I would have been called, and he, we talked about it, and he was like, I don't think that your testimony is going to add anything that the DA wouldn't turn around and, put you on the stand and ask you questions like, did you fall below the standard of care?
The big legal test, right? The big legal test. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is the same reason that we didn't have an expert witness, because in one fell swoop, that question would have turned them into, it would have taken away any possible thing that they could have positively contributed. Because if you're just asking basic facts, and that whole idea of the standard of care was the one thing that they could associate with the language of the law, where they could pin that charge to me without intent, without any of that. It was about a standard. And so the question would have simply been, did this nurse fall below the standard of care? Did she do what a reasonable and prudent nurse have done the same thing, without mentioning intentionally in there?
And I would imagine that the answer to that would have been yes. This nurse fell below the standard of care. Is that the issue here? Yeah. Yeah. And then that's it.
And that's it. And they played that 2-hour recorded interview that I did with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And it I don't really know what else. I couldn't have added a lot more to that. I certainly could have, said some other things, but, Chris, you understand how the trial setting works. It's not an open discussion. It's not an opportunity for me to simply present an entire picture of things. they get to argue back and forth about what is even deemed relevant or appropriate. And you can't just ask a question or present something. It's got to be relevant, or they'll say, no, that's not relevant. You know, I don't get to just go up there and talk. I don't get to talk about what happened. And again, even if I did, the answer to the basic question is it doesn't matter how I got here. It doesn't matter that at the end of the day, I wound up being the subject of a criminal investigation that started with a facility losing a bunch of money and a facility failing to report per its federal guidelines. It doesn't matter how we got here. The fact is we're here now. And the only question is, did this person fall below the standard of practice? And the answer is yes.
And if that's all they're judging you on, then that's a tough that's a tough hole to get out of, isn't it? If that's the legal test. What was it like for you sitting in a courtroom in your own trial and a jury sitting there? I thought that was kind of interesting too, that you had a jury trial. I don't know if that was a choice or not a choice, or if that's just standard in Tennessee. Maybe it's standard.
That's standard.
What was that experience like for you, besides terrible?
It was somewhat awkward because, I'm sitting here and I'm facing them. We're looking right at each other. And we did the jury selection on the first day. And there were certainly some individuals that were really good candidates for the jury, but the DA's office struck those. So, the jury that we had was the jury that we both selected, and I don't know, it's awkward. It's awkward. You don't know. I'm a people person. I look at people and talk to people and smile at people. What are you supposed to do? Do I look at them? Do I smile at them? Does that look like a sociopath? Do I look like a sociopath if I'm smiling? Am I supposed to show emotion? Am I not supposed to show emotion? Am I supposed to set my limoncello LaCroix on the table or hide it because someone watching it on the news will think that I'm some kind of weird, person for having a limoncello LaCroix on the table?
So what did you do?
I poured it in a cup and threw the can in the trash.
Oh, God. And did you make eye contact with the jury? Did you smile? Did you not smile?
No, I tried to just be polite and, just not do anything that would really cause any other attention to myself. And about half the time, I probably just kept my face buried, because it was very emotional. It was very emotional. If you're going to court, don't wear makeup. It's pointless.
We all saw that. I mean, I remember seeing you in trial and seeing how emotional it was, and everybody just, heart's breaking for you. Hard to imagine that experience.
And then I'm sitting there during a portion of that, and obviously the Tennessean is there and they're recording that. And, they followed this case and they wrote a lot of great articles. They were there and they had, their camera set up, and, I was having, a moment. We were on a break, and I just remember looking up, and that camera is pointed right at me, and we're not even in session anymore. It's just there. The live feed is just, whoop, we're back to break, and it's right back on my face. And I just felt like I had no privacy. I just needed a moment to just sit. And so I remember I literally took the computer monitor and moved it up and then moved it in front of the camera screen so I could put my head behind it and just have a moment where I felt like I wasn't being watched under a microscope.
I have to tell you, though, as an observer and a nurse, and you were exactly like you should have been in that moment. Every once in a while you see someone at trial and they're so cool and there's not a tear and there's not any emotion, and sometimes they're even, a little smirky or seem a little arrogant. And it's like sometimes at a funeral and someone's not crying, they're all completely pulled together, and then you see someone weeping and you're like, that's exactly what's right for this moment. This is a terrible thing happening. Tears and
I'm not a very good person to, you know, I I pretty much wear my emotions on my sleeve. I can keep it together, but I'm not a, you know, you can ask my husband. I'm not a good liar. Even like little white lies or hiding surprises. I don't know how I pulled off his birthday party, like for his 40th birthday party as a surprise, because I'm just not good. I'm not good at that. And he tells me, like, you have that look on your face.
you're busted.
I'm pretty transparently open in who I am. It's hard because you feel it feels invasive, feels a little invasive, and you're very vulnerable. You're extremely vulnerable to the entire world. You know, at a point in time when you are literally feeling at your lowest.
All eyes are on you. Literally, the whole world was watching you.
Yeah. But at the same time, I was so grateful. I just wanted it to be over, regardless of the outcome. I just wanted it to be over. I didn't want this to be stuck over my head anymore. I didn't want this to be stuck over Miss Murphy's family's head anymore. They deserved to grieve and move on. I deserved to grieve and move on. We both deserved to move forward. And this thing hanging over our lives for 4.5 years, it takes a toll. And so I really just wanted, I was like, I don't care. I don't care what happens. I'm just grateful that we have reached this day and we are going to be done. And I knew the guilty verdict was coming.
How did you know that?
I just knew. I just knew. Yeah. So when Kim Potter was found guilty, do you remember that police officer up in New York who pulled her gun instead of her taser?
Mm-hmm.
Her guilty verdict and sentencing was, it preceded mine by a few months. And I remember having this conversation with a good friend of mine who is a state trooper. And he said, RaDonda, there's no way that a jury is going to find you guilty, knowing everything they know. And I was like, you realize that Kim, they just found her guilty, and she's going to prison. And he said, the difference is the precedent has already been set in my line of work. It hasn't been set in yours,
But now it has.
But I knew. I knew. And then immediately when the DA opened with their initial discussion and jury selection, Kim Potter's case was brought up immediately, and I knew. I knew right then and there. I'm like, we're talking about the same thing here. We're talking about a standard. They're holding me to a standard. I fell below it. They're going to find me guilty because that's the question. The question wasn't that I intend to cause harm. The question was, did I fall below a standard? And I did.
So talk to us about that ending, the day that the jury came back, and tell us a little bit about what exactly you were charged with, and then what the sentencing was, and how it's going now, because you're a year past that, right? Or more than a year past that?
More than a year. Yeah. So the the guilty verdict, like I said, I knew that was coming. I felt it in my gut, and I'd had a lot of time to just think about, how I had perceived things. You just know, right? Nurses, you have that in tune sense of things. Like, I just knew. And so I'd prepared myself for that. And when they read the verdict, I just kept really calm and accepted it. And I just went home. I just said, I want to go home. I want to go home. It's over. It's done with. We'll deal with the next phase. And then, the reality sets in that you could potentially be sentenced to prison. So then there was, a month and a half of preparing for life as that may be. If I would have to go to prison, what would be the daily responsibilities? How does my husband log in to pay our electric bill? You know, the reality of day-to-day things, gathering your life as if you might not be here for an extended amount of time. So I, again, just I didn't set myself up to be disappointed, because that was one thing that I had found over the years was each time I had a little bit of hope that something would go a different way, it didn't. And I really got tired of setting myself up to be disappointed. So I just set the bar for my expectations at zero. I had no expectations for anything other than just whatever the worst case possible scenario would be. Because anything else, I could accept being happy about that if it wasn't that way, but I just couldn't accept the disappointment of being let down again if it didn't go that way. Does that make sense?
It does. I just wonder if that technique worked for you, like just to set yourself up for the worst case scenario.
Yeah. I mean, I just set my expectations exceptionally low. Just the bar was low.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, terrible. I don't know. I don't know why I said awesome. I didn't mean awesome, but I'm glad it worked for you. I'm glad that strategy worked for you.
It worked.
And so the charges are though you were found guilty of. Would you mind just saying?
I was charged originally with criminally negligent homicide. That was the charge that was brought against me, which is a Class D felony, and abuse of an impaired adult, which is a Class C felony. I was found guilty of a lesser charge in the state of Tennessee of I'm sorry, it was reckless homicide. I was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, which is a lesser charge than reckless homicide. And I was also still found guilty of the elder abuse charge. And so those carried, one carried 1 to 3 years, and the other one carried 3 to 6 years. So it was up to the judge to determine sentencing, what the length would be and what type of sentencing. During the course of that, you actually meet with the Department of Corrections between your guilty verdict and your sentencing, and you participate in essentially gathering a report to determine what your risk for recidivism is, which is to repeat the crime again. And you go through all of this information. They ask you a bunch of questions, and they compile a report with a score on it. And that information goes to the judge, and they utilize that to determine what risk you would be for repeating a crime. If it's low and you don't have a prior history of criminal activity, and your charges are a Class C felony or lesser, C, D, or E, then within the state of Tennessee, there is a presumption or an assumption within the law that you should not go to prison. And so my attorney and I felt fairly confident that that would be the case. But again, you don't always know. It's at the judge's discretion. It depends on what the DA has to say at the sentencing hearing. And that he did make me aware that, they would have the opportunity to present an argument at the sentencing hearing. We were really fortunate that Judge Smith sentenced me to 3 years of probation combined to be served jointly for both of those charges, and that she also granted me judicial diversion. The DA argued very heavily against that, but ultimately,
What is judicial diversion?
so judicial diversion is it's a statute or some language that's written within the law, so that if you are a person who has been found guilty, usually it's associated with someone who pleads guilty, in a negotiation. Not so often is it given after someone has found guilty at a jury trial. But judicial diversion means the judge essentially, after you've been found guilty, they will hold that file and it's reverted. It's not actually filed. The criminal charges aren't technically filed and then expunged. They are actually just held until you meet the criteria for your probation period. And then that's it. It's to allow a person who maybe had a license of some sort of professional license or some sort of a skill set to be able to return to their previous status within the community so that they could work, so that they could pass a background check, so that they could return to doing those things if they met the criteria and followed the rules of probation. So as of right now, I am not a felon, even though I have been found guilty of 2 felony charges. If you were to run a background check, I've not been officially charged as a felon. I just have to abide by the rules of my probation as set in Davidson County. And as long as I do that over the course of the next year and a half for the total of 3, then those charges will essentially be filed away and they will not be a part of my criminal record.
Good. That's amazing.
However, the elder abuse charge is associated with a registry, an abuse registry for the state of Tennessee, and I will remain on that for life.
Oh boy.
So that will still show up on a background check.
It's hard for me to even imagine that charge, like how out of the actual event and the facts about what happened. But what's it like being on parole?
You know, I have this card that I carry around with me. It says that I am a violent offender. And anytime I would encounter a police officer or anyone in law enforcement, I have to present it to them. So I'm very cautious about not speeding because I do kind of have a heavy foot in the past, and I've definitely gotten my fair share of speeding tickets. So I got pulled over one day because the headlight was out on one side of my car and I didn't know why I was being pulled over. But then I had to hand this card, you know, with this bright red letter that says violent offender to this officer. And, you know, it's what I'm supposed to do, and tell him I'm not a threat to you, sir. In the current climate, you know, of things within law enforcement and police, you know, I'm not a threat to you. You can Google my name when you get back to your patrol car. You know, that's it. I just blurted it out. I'm like, I'm not a threat to you, which is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And do you just have to do that during the course of your parole, or does that go on eternally that you have to show that card?
Just during the course of my probation. And then once that's done, it's done. And then, of course, you know, traveling out of state, the Department of Corrections officers that I've worked with have been absolutely fantastic. They really do have a great understanding of what I think people need to support them moving forward. And my officer has been really, you know, really easy to work with, and, you know, understanding of trying to make sure that we both move forward. Like I could move forward with life, meeting the criteria for my probation, but also still being able to do the things that I need to do. So if I need to go across the state line into Kentucky for work, for the farm, which I do often, it's 10 miles away. I would literally have to call her, go to her office in the opposite direction, have a piece of paper signed each individual time, and then take it with me. So we worked to get some things in order so that I can travel as needed for work, which is helpful, you know, that we don't have to go through that constant paperwork all the time. And, you know, I've just learned a little bit more about, it's just more of a learning curve about the process.
Yeah. Did you ever think that this would be part of a conversation, of your daily conversation?
No.
No, I guess not. So how are you doing now? Like, really, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm a lot better. You know, I'm I'm learning to associate the feeling of happiness with just being happy. For a long time, it was happiness followed immediately by guilt. So again, the expectation for setting the bar really low, you know, it was too hard to be happy because to be happy meant that I was immediately reminded I didn't deserve to be happy. I didn't feel like I deserved to be happy. So I immediately reminded myself of the guilt. And that, that's hard. You start to not take great care of yourself, and inherently that affects, the relationships and the people around you. And so it takes its toll. So it's having the weight of the trial gone helps immensely. Having the opportunity to talk with so many different groups of people in healthcare, and share the things that I've learned over this story, that helps immensely. The kindness of people, that helps. And so all of these things slowly but surely have really given me some hope moving forward that life is going to be okay. It will be different from what I anticipated, but it can still be okay. And I can still do something good and positive. Um, it's a choice, right?
Yeah, it is in part, no doubt. But brilliant for you to be where you are. I'm impressed every time I talk to you
Thank you.
that you are where you are. So amazing. And something you said to me on the phone the other day has been so stuck in my head, I can't even tell you, is when you were telling me a little bit about the story about Mrs. Murphy's grandson and his kindness to you. You said something like that level of kindness and compassion can't happen without the level of terribleness of the event that happened. You said that the really, really extremely good just doesn't happen without the really extremely bad. And I love that perspective from you.
Yeah, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
It's basic laws of physics, right? So for every horrible, tragic, visceral, gut wrenching emotion that is as far down into the depths of your soul as you think it could be, there is an opposite of that across the spectrum that is so humbling and fulfilling and kind and gracious. And you can't, I don't, you can't, it is impossible to understand what that feels like without having gone through the experience of knowing that loss and tragedy. And
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I feel like we could talk forever, but it's getting late in your world and mine. And we could have 15 different podcasts about 15 different subjects, but I want to ask you two final questions. One is one that I ask everybody about what you think, what you want the whole world to know about medication errors in hospitals or whatever your part of the story is. But something that really also has stuck in my brain since we talked last week when you were making that long drive from Atlanta back to Nashville is you talked to me about a recent presentation that you made in Washington, D.C. And while you were sitting there listening to the talk on pharmaceutical errors, and I'm not sure what the whole conference was about, you explained that you had an aha moment that you'd kind of been waiting to show up. Can you share that with us? Because that is also rattling around in my head nonstop since you told me.
yes, and it has been for me too. So I was at the healthcare's U.S. Pharmacopoeia. They set standards for compounding drugs in the United States. Lots of regulatory agencies they work with, the FDA, et cetera. And they were having their healthcare, I may butcher the title of this meeting, but it was their healthcare annual safety and quality meeting. I may have left a word out there. Sorry, it is getting late. You're right. And so I had spoke and I was listening to some other individuals talk after me, and they were having a discussion about various different perspectives of quality and safety in healthcare. And one of the members on the panel was the director for education for the ANA, and the other one was a retired surgeon who suffers with rheumatoid arthritis. And they were talking about these different perspectives on things. And an individual asked a question about, whether healthcare was a right, or, until we could really determine what healthcare itself was, how could we determine what the level of quality was, that we measure quality by? Because really, as of right now, we only measure that by your standards of care, right? It has to be quantitative. It's hard to measure quality as a subjective measurement when everyone's subjective experience is going to be different. So our quality is measured by our standards of practice. And I started thinking about these standards and how that worked in the field of healthcare. And then, we're here and we're talking about dealing with mistakes, dealing with errors, dealing with problems, dealing with quality. How do we make the delivery of care in all aspects of a higher quality and one that is more safe? If we are measuring those things by our standard of care, and our standard of care as nursing doesn't address the fact that we will ultimately err.
Yeah, without a doubt.
There's Without a doubt. I mean, it's been 23, 24 years now since To Err is Human was published. And if to err is human, what is the human to do when they err? Our professional standards, our standards of care, the standards of practice, except whatever you deem them, wherever you are, there are standards, and that is the way that you are supposed to act in accordance to your profession. We don't have any vested interest according to our standards of care or our standards of practice that help us move forward when things don't go as planned. How are we supposed to learn how to move forward if the basics of our standards of care don't set us up with a pathway to do so? How can you get your stakeholder nurses to be invested in the process of improving safety and quality delivery of care if there is no standard for how we do so? Right? And we can take this one step further just by making an example from the airline industry, right? And I told this to a nurse the other day. I was talking with her after I spoke with you. And I was like, where is the oxygen mask in an airplane? Where's it located? What do you do with it when it falls out? And what do you help someone else before you help yourself? Where's the life vest under the seat? Do you know how to put it on? Yep. You know how to blow it up if it doesn't pull to inflate? Yep. In the event that cabin pressure changes, in the event that we have a water landing, right? And we never hear about these things happening, but I guarantee you that everyone who's ever flown on an aircraft knows exactly what to do if things go wrong, because they've made it a standard in their practice to be prepared for that. They've realized that there is the potential for significant loss of life if they don't have a plan in place. And it's much better to know ahead of time than to try to figure out what to do when you have a 747 falling from 30,000 feet. That is where healthcare is right now. We are a 747 falling from 30,000 feet. Nurses don't have a plan. We don't have a plan because our profession as a whole doesn't have a stake in moving things forward. We're a bottom line. We're a budget item. We're expendable. And they're mostly sick and tired of it. We need a plan moving forward. We need support from the people who are writing guidelines in how we should operate. We shouldn't be leaving it up to the criminal justice system to determine how we practice and what our standards of practice are going to be, or when we fail to meet those standards of practice. It should never reach the level of the criminal law. They have their job to do. I respect it. This didn't do any justice for healthcare, didn't do any justice for patient safety. If we want to make things more safe, if we want to improve our quality of care, then we need a clear direction moving forward. And the people who dictate the basics of our practice need to get behind that, because a position statement doesn't hold up in court. We need guidelines in our practice, knowing that it is a potential that someone will err. When you deviate, what do? What is your professional responsibility? What is your licensed responsibility as a provider to yourself, to the institution, to the patient? What is your level of responsibility here? Because it hasn't been clearly dictated, and therefore no one knows.
I think that is just brilliant, RaDonda. I think there are some points in there that you're going to work out and bring out, and there's something really specific in your future that's hopefully, very hopefully, if you've got the right audience and willingness to change from the healthcare system, that you can make some change there. You know what I love too about your airline analogy is like, everybody on the plane knows what the plan is if things start to go wrong. It's not just the pilot. It's not just the pilot and the flight attendants. Everybody in the room. So the analogy to healthcare to that would be, you actually have the doctors, the nurses, the patient, and their families. Everybody says, like, listen, we hope this plane is going to land safely. But if it doesn't, if we get on some bumpy roads along the way, here's what we're going to do. We're going to all work together for the safest, best outcome. I'm crazy about this idea, and I just wish you all the best and support, if I could give it to you, in moving it forward. I know when we talked on that drive, I was so flattered to hear that you'd listened to one of my podcasts on your way to Atlanta, and it was with Leilani Schweitzer. And let me tell you, anybody listening, if you haven't listened to that podcast on Inside Medical Malpractice, please do. But in the most amazing coincidence, and this is a true story, I hung up the phone from you and I had an email from Leilani Schweitzer asking me to do something for her, which of course 100% will do. And I said to her, listen, you won't believe this, but I don't know if you know who RaDonda Vaught is, but I was just on the phone with her. I was literally just talking to you. And, you had told me that day that her work with Stanford University after her, medical error in her experience, you found it motivating, that she found, purpose out of pain, or however you want to call that. And I want to read you just a little tiny line of an email that Leilani sent me yesterday. Listen to this. She said, of course, I know RaDonda Vaught's story, at least as it has been portrayed in the media. I'm going to cry when I say this. It touched me so much. What a wrenching, terrible story. She and I will both be at a conference in October, and I so look forward to meeting her and looking her in the eye. Please tell her that I said so. I'm sorry for everything that was done to her, and I can't wait to hear your discussion with her. That happened 5 minutes after you and I got off the phone. I was just blown away. I think the two of you could be a force, and her from the perspective of the family that's experienced the error and the death, and you from the perspective of the nurse, which she has so much compassion for the healthcare providers who make mistakes. That blows me away. So
the world does work in mysterious ways, doesn't it?
Isn't that the truth?
Oh, that's so amazing. I had no idea that she was going to be there in October, but now I am so grateful. I'm so grateful. Again, I have Charlene Murphy and her family to thank, that I have been able to meet so many kind and wonderful people with all of these amazing perspectives and all of this knowledge and wealth of information and this motivation and drive. When you get people like that together, I just feel like when the right people come together, there's no stopping what can be done. And if I can just keep moving forward with this concept that there has to be a brighter future in healthcare, and that she didn't just die in vain. We won't just forget her story and her loss and her sacrifice. We will work to make it better. And if I can be a part of that, to me, that is what justice looks like for someone who lost their life. It is, how do you make it better? Because I guarantee you, she wouldn't have wanted this to happen to someone else, and her family wouldn't want this to happen to someone else.
No. You honor all of us in nursing, and I'm sure you'll honor the Murphy family and your own family and the supporters through this by doing that, by finding some kind of purpose to make healthcare better. And I have zero doubt, I have absolutely zero doubt that you have the power and the wisdom and the wherewithal to do it. So why don't we end this podcast here? It's been, I don't even have the right words for it, RaDonda. I feel like this is maybe my favorite podcast I've ever recorded for a lot of reasons, but partly because it feels so important. It feels like one of the most important podcasts I've ever recorded. I'm so struck by your courage to tell your story, by your open, honest dialogue, by what seems to be an accepting attitude of what's happened, and then finding a way to, finding a path forward to make things better for everybody around you. Because I can think that other people going through what you've gone through could have reacted in very different ways. Their attitudes could have changed in very different. This would break a lot of people, and no one would blame them for that. This could break a lot of people, break a lot of hearts, and break a lot of spirits. So, if you enjoyed this podcast, I want to hear from you. Maybe RaDonda wants to hear from you, maybe not. Maybe her box of letters is kind of full, but. I just want to say thank you. And in the luckiest crazy way that the world works, we talked about this last week. I'm going to be in Nashville for the first time in my life on September 12th-ish. And RaDonda and I are going to meet up, and I'm going to take her out for dinner for all this hard work that she's put in to give us this amazing podcast. So I'm also really looking forward to that. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate this. I appreciate the perspective that you bring in your other podcasts. And I know this one is a little different. So thank you for having me here. And I know we've spent a lot of time talking. If your listeners make it to the end of this, good for them.
We'll find out. I might break it into 2 podcasts so we can keep people. But I have no doubt it's not because of the interest. It's just finding the time. But I might split this into 2 and we'll make it work. Don't you worry about it. But before we say goodbye, I want to again say super thanks to RaDonda, and a special thanks to all of you who are listening, and especially if you made it to the end of this podcast. But if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe and leave us a review. And don't forget that in many jurisdictions in both the U.S. and Canada, nurses, doctors, and lawyers can claim continuing education credit for listening in. The podcast is, of course, available on all the usual platforms and on the Inside Medical Malpractice YouTube channel. For nurses in the U.S., you can tune in and listen and receive credit on CE Broker. And be sure to tune in over the next couple of months as we tackle the tough and timely subject of infection control as the last of the top 5 issues that lead to malpractice litigation in healthcare. So goodbye and thank you, and take good care.